Hello and welcome to my channel. My name's Daniel and I'm so glad that you guys are here. I know that you guys have been waiting for more C.S. Lewis videos, and here you have it. Today we're going to be talking about The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. This is yet again another book in the collection that I'm going book by book through and doing book reviews of, and I know that you guys have all been waiting for it, and here it is. So let's get down to it and talk about this absolutely fascinating, sophisticated book, The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. So I don't usually get to making a video the same day that I finish a book, so this is fresh on my mind, and man, is this an absolutely exciting read. This book is so short, so compact, and such a good read. It was only 160 pages, just about, give or take. But man, were there so many good points to be made in this book. I was completely unprepared. The problem of pain. What's the problem of pain? So I knew before I even opened the book, it's got to be about, if there is a good God, how can there be suffering on earth? I got that. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely what this book has to be about. But man, did C.S. Lewis open up a can of worms getting into this one. This book is thoroughly detailed, argument by argument, in succession. He doesn't just make arguments for why God can be good and there can also be suffering, but he tells a story while doing it. He literally makes a timeline map of humanity from creation to the fall to where we are now, and explaining in detail with different points, point by point, all of these in-depth topics as to why we could still have a good God and why suffering may not even be acceptable but necessary. So obviously the book starts off with the whole question, if there's a good God, why are we in pain? Why is there disease? Why are children dying? Why are all these terrible things happening? And C.S. Lewis starts off with the more ambiguous points, the more broader points as to how is it really possible for there to be an existence like we have it without suffering? He brings up a point like saying two people exist on the same planet. Could two people really exist on the same planet without one of them being inconvenienced? Now imagine that there was person A, and the trees flocked to give person A shade, and all the stones moved to be exactly where it would be most convenient for person A. Now, if that was the case, wouldn't it be possible for all of the things that are happening to give person A the perfect life? Couldn't those things that are happening possibly be an inconvenience to person B? How could everything line up to give everybody the ultimate perfect experience? That was one of his more vague points. That's not the way the whole book goes, but he was just making the point that is it really fair to assume that there is a possible reality without even the slightest of inconveniences? It kind of goes back to the whole argument, could God create a stone large enough that he couldn't lift? And the answer to the argument is that the question is ridiculous and doesn't even need to be answered. You don't need a logical answer to an illogical question. But once C.S. Lewis gets past the broader aspects of the question, the more generalized aspects, then he gets into the thick of humanity. He starts getting into creation, and he imagines what man, Adam and Eve, would have been like before the fall. He imagines a world. What would happen if we didn't have choice at all? Because that's one of the questions. Why didn't God just make us perfect? Why didn't God just make us the way so that nothing terrible would ever happen? Well, we would just be robots. How can God create us to love him if we are forced to love him at gunpoint? If we're forced to just do everything, we have no free will whatsoever. It's not in the nature of love to force anybody to do anything. And so that is the foundation principle to this question, is that can there be love without free will? And he creates this whole picture of the creation of man and woman and this whole idea of temptation and what the fall ultimately did to mankind in general. And one thing that really stuck out to me is that C.S. Lewis said that after the fall, mankind was no longer itself. It wasn't really a change in intellect. It wasn't just that we learned more and we understood good and evil, but mankind itself didn't just flip its switch, but was ultimately completely different. Whatever mankind was before the fall is completely different than mankind after the fall. No comparison. And if you read this absolutely fantastic book, then you'll be able to see how C.S. Lewis really draws that out and goes into depth explaining what he means by that. Then, of course, C.S. Lewis goes into our free will, how the fact that we have free will to choose opens up the opportunity to choose incorrectly. The age-old term for that would be sin, missing the mark, choosing wrong, doing wrong. And he talks about how sin is different from pain in a certain way. Pain doesn't cause more pain. When the pain ends, we're relieved, we're happy, we're glad that it's gone. But once we sin, sin causes us to sin more. We don't sin and then stop and go, oh, wow, I'm glad that's over with. Now I can be happy. Sin is cyclical and only begets more and more sin. He brought this up because one of the points against his argument is, well, couldn't God just undo that one mistake so that we can just start all over? And his point was that no matter how many times God undoes those mistakes, that men would just get right back to where they were all over again, time and time again. And if God did just control everything, then mankind would ultimately never achieve anything meaningful because God would have just been pulling on our strings like puppets the whole time. Then C.S. Lewis gets into pain itself. And he talks about how pain, yes, we can make reasons for why it's okay for there to be pain, but then he goes on to the other side of the coin and actually makes pain possibly a positive thing. How pain turns us to God. Pain grows us as people. He talks about how people who often suffer much, grow much, learn to find true joy and true happiness in life, while people that are handed things on a silver platter their whole lives and don't endure these pains don't grow as a person. They don't grow in character. They don't learn to endure the things of life and are generally weaker in nature as a result. This ultimately turns to the picture of Christ on the cross. The whole point that C.S. Lewis is ultimately trying to make is that in the end, pain becomes our redemption. It becomes a redeeming factor in humanity that ultimately brings us closer to God. He talks about the necessity for pain, how it causes us to become closer to God. But not only that, but C.S. Lewis talks about the necessity for sacrifice. He goes into the Old Testament and talks about how there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. And he talks about how this really, if you took away the scriptures, if you took away the Bible, it is still a universal understanding. Think about the image of the phoenix. The phoenix has to die. It's all burned up in order for there to be new life. Think about the analogy of the seed. The seed must die so that the plant can grow. We all understand in our daily lives that through suffering, through pain, we grow stronger. We understand that if you're a weightlifter, you don't just go into the gym, do some light stretching, drink a nice energy drink, and become Arnold Schwarzenegger. No, to become like Arnold Schwarzenegger, you need to put in the work. You need to tear your muscles over and over and over again. You need to push yourself beyond your limits. And this, unless you're Arnold, because for some reason he loves the pain, is an unpleasant act. It's not necessarily immediately enjoyable, but after the workout is done, then as long as you feed yourself properly, your muscles grow. But it is through the pain, through the pushing, that you grow, become stronger and better. So really, I'm just trying to say that this analogy is ingrained in us. It is something we so easily understand. But then whenever a Christian brings up Christ on the cross, that doesn't make any sense. That's cosmic child abuse. But really, these are things that we understand from an early age and have always made sense to us unless you put it into a different light. Then C.S. Lewis goes into hell and talks about how can a good God send somebody to be tormented for the rest of their lives. He goes into depth on that. I don't really want to touch too much on that. He does write a whole book called The Great Divorce, which is pretty much making the point that hell is locked from the inside. I did a book review on it. Feel free to watch it to see what C.S. Lewis thinks. But then after hell, he talks about the idea of animal pain, because animals are innocent. They're not thinking, conscious beings. They're just minding their own business. And yes, they do things that we would call cruel and vicious, but they don't have a moral law to be held subject to. They don't have a moral standard to keep them accountable. So why should they endure suffering here on earth if they did nothing to deserve it? And he goes pretty deep into that. He talks about the difference between sentience and consciousness, which literally just blew my mind listening to that today and reading that today. And it's just, there's so many great, strong arguments. I think that if you're just afraid that this book is just going to be about, well, God's good, why does earth suck? It's not just that. There are so many great arguments. This isn't just one single argument. He goes into the whole idea of Christian suffering, Christian growth, the idea of sacrifice, the crucifixion of Christ. He goes in depth into all of these subjects. And I know, how can it go in depth when it's only 160 pages? But his words are dense. I've read so many authors that could write a whole book to make one point. But the thing is, every sentence is weighty when it comes to C.S. Lewis. Every argument is monumental. I learned so much more just reading one short little book from C.S. Lewis than I do reading so many other entire books and entire arguments from all these other Christian authors that it's just, there's no comparison. So I definitely recommend getting into this book. To top it all off, C.S. Lewis talks about heaven, because when it comes to the Christian point of view, at the end of the day, if you read through the Pauline epistles and you read through the New Testament, it says that yes, there is suffering here on earth, but there is no comparison for what there lies ahead of you. The greatness of heaven overshadows all of the pain and suffering on this earth. So let's recap the book real quick. The question is asked, how can there be a good, benevolent God in the midst of such suffering and pain? And so C.S. Lewis goes on to say, I honestly doubt that there is any other way of existence. The idea of this fairy tale world where everybody coexists happily is probably illogical and nonsensical, but I'm going to entertain it anyways. So he goes in to talk about how pain is most likely justified. But then he goes farther than that to say not only is pain justified, but it's ultimately necessary for our own personal growth, development, and to grow closer to God. That whole discussion pretty much culminates to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Then he goes into the topic of hell. How can there be such a terrible place when there's such a good God? Then he talks about animals. Animals are dumb. They don't know any better. Why do they deserve to suffer? Then he talks about heaven, the ultimate reward for our life here on earth. And that's pretty much the summation of the whole story. It is very compact. And I know that I talk about a lot of books by C.S. Lewis, and I talk about how great they are, but this one is definitely probably one of my favorites that I've read so far. It's up there on the list. Whenever I get through this whole collection of books, I'm definitely going to be rating them from top to bottom, and this one is definitely going to be up there because it was a great read. So I know that it's great that I can tell you about C.S. Lewis and some books, but you do not get the same thing from hearing me talk about his books that you would if you were to read it. You can go ahead and pick up The Problem of Pain, or you can just go on YouTube and Google The Problem of Pain audiobook and listen to it in 4 hours and get way more out of it than you ever would just listening to me give my nice, beautiful, humble opinion about the matter. I'm so glad that I'm able to read these books and share my thoughts about it because I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan. If you want to see more book reviews, any books in general I do range from finances to C.S. Lewis, other Christian authors, life in general, fiction books, you name it, I'm going to read it, I'm going to talk about it. If you want to see more intellectual videos talking about words, meaning, etc., it's a good time. Please hit that subscribe button if you really learned something, enjoyed this book today, hit that like button. I'm gonna keep them coming. I'm making more videos more frequently. So I'm just so glad that you guys are here. I'm so glad I get to be doing this. And I just hope you have an absolutely fantastic day. Have a great day, guys.